feeding of the 5,000. Going back to the Gospel of Mark. We're going to look at it mainly from Mark 6, 30 through 44. But it's found in Matthew, and Luke, and John. In fact, except for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, this is the only miracle that is reported by all four: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, some of them are reported one time, two times, or three times in different arrangements, but all four tell us about the feeding of the 5,000. Why would that be? Well, let's kind of help us remind us what we have when we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. People were telling the stories about Jesus. And here there were 5,000 witnesses to this one. There have been a lot of people telling, oh yes, I was there that day, and could testify to what had occurred that day. And so that story would have been told many, many times. Now Matthew was there, and John was there. And Mark, we're going to be studying Mark. If he wasn't there, he knew those who were there would have heard this story many times from many people. And Luke, he came down later and he tried to check it all out and said, well, here's what happened. And he wrote down what happened after he searched diligently into these things. And so, since there were so many that saw this miracle and experienced it and benefited from it, is probably why it was told so many times, and maybe why it shows up in all four of these accounts. Let's begin in Mark 6, verses 30 through 32. The apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said unto them, come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. For there were many coming and going, and they had no leisure so much as to eat, and they departed to a desert place by ship privately. Let's put this in context. Jesus had sent those apostles out on their first missionary tour. Don't go to the Gentiles, don't go to the Samaritans, go to the villages around Galilee, 2 by 2. He gave them powers to perform miracles and cast out demons and to preach the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And they'd been doing this. Now they've come back to Jesus to report to Him. And there's so many people now interested in gathering around. They just don't have time for themselves. Here they're wanting to talk to Jesus about what had occurred, and Jesus wants to hear, but they can't even get time to eat together. There's so many coming and going and pressing. And Jesus says, let's go out and rest a while. And we got to do that sometime. We need to just realize, listen, that Jesus and His apostles need to just say, look, I got to get away and go off and rest a while. And go off to a desert place. Go off into the wilderness. There's something calming. And it just helps the mind to clear. I know Lori and I, sometime we get hectic and say, you know what we need to do? We need to go down and sit in the creek. We'll go down to Hickory Creek and just sit there and let the water flow past and kind of let our cares just wash down the river, you know. But to find the time to rest is good. And so when things are really getting hectic, we need to think about that. But there may have been other reasons why they needed to rest. I'm going to say this about this miracle. He fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and 2 fishes, and they had 12 baskets left over. Do you believe that? Listen, here's something I want to get back to. I don't want to miss. These things are written that we might believe. And the fact that it's told by all 4, and then you start looking at the context and the incidental details they record, these are credible stories. So yeah, it gives us reasons to believe. At the end of this, if you wonder whether Jesus really did this, we get to the end of this lesson, you consider these things, you'll be a believer. But it's just the way and the nature and the things that are told in this story. Now they're all pressed about and they've got to get away. There may be another reason they need to get away. And that is Herod had heard of Jesus. And that's what we'd studied last time we were in Mark. It was fast in the spring, and I'm going to get back to studying from Mark regularly. But remember, Herod had beheaded John the Baptist. And then he hears about a man in Galilee, and he's doing these miracles, and old superstitious Herod, he's thinking, well, maybe John the Baptist rose from the dead. And the idea that maybe when he went into the dead, he came back with special powers, and John the Baptist, Herod didn't understand this, but Herod had killed John the Baptist. And now he's hearing about a man in Galilee. Is he going to kill Jesus? See, this had come to Herod's attention, and so there's more focus on this, but there's something else. Another reason they may have needed to get away. We read it in John chapter 6 and verse 14, and this is in connection with this story, where it says Jesus perceived they would come and take him by force and make him a king. Jesus is in Galilee in a very volatile period in Israel's history, where there were many zealots, and there were many that, remembering the story of the Maccabees, how they had thrown off Antiochus, are thinking, maybe we'll have a Messiah. The time has come for the Messiah to throw off Herod and Rome, and we're ready for that. And there were those thinking Jesus will be the one. We'll make him that king. We'll make him that ruler to do this. And that tension is building. And that's not the kind of kingdom Jesus came to bring. Jesus turns to his apostles. So you're worn out. Herod's worried about me, and we got so many people here ready for a rebellion. It's time for us. We just got to get away for a little bit. Let's get off to ourselves here. And so they did. I want to point this out. They came to a desert place. It says again, they departed into a desert place. And I don't think it was some dry, barren landscape with the sands shifting and the cactus growing and the coyotes howling, and like you'd think of a desert. That's not the kind of, like a desert out in the west, and there are deserts over there, but that's not what this is talking about. It's a deserted place. Now, some people have looked at this in Acts, where Philip went down to Gaza. He said to go down from Jerusalem to Gaza, which is desert. And they think, well, he got out here in the middle of a big dry desert somewhere and found the Ethiopian reading his Bible, and he couldn't have immersed him. They're out in the middle of a desert. They wouldn't have water to immerse someone if they're out in the middle of a desert like this. But they came to a certain water, and there was enough water for them to both go down into the water to be baptized and come up out of the water. Well, why did he call it a desert? It's because it's deserted. It's not little water. It's few people. And that's what Jesus was doing. He wasn't trying to get away from water. He was trying to get away from people. In fact, he got to this desert by a ship. Did you see that? They departed into a desert place by ship. There's enough water there for a ship. It's right on the edge of the Sea of Galilee. And we get further into this story, it's covered with grass, and it's green and abundant. And so don't think of a barren place. Think of a place out in the wilderness where you can get away from people. Now, the people saw him departing. And this is going to enter into the story a little bit to think how this could have happened. It says, many knew him and ran afoot thither out of all the cities and outwent them and came unto them. How did they beat the ship to this place? Running along the shore. Well, maybe there wasn't much wind blowing. They just kind of having to row that boat along. They weren't going very fast. And those along the shore, it was still waters on Galilee. And those along the shore, they see the ship and they're following it. And they're getting ahead of it because when it comes near, I want to be there. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? Were they remembering the story of the Maccabees? You see, when the Maccabees began their rebellion, they went out into the wilderness and the people came to them. And there are those wanting Jesus to take over like this. Were they thinking maybe, all right, he's making his move. Let's go out there and we'll form the army with him out there like the Maccabees did? That couldn't have been. There were those wanting to take him by force. When Jesus saw them, he didn't say, oh, no, all these people. No, he saw them and he was moved with compassion. And notice how he said they were as sheep not having a shepherd. He loved them. They were confused. They didn't understand, but they were seeking something. And instead of rejecting them, he received them. He welcomed them. And he taught them. They need to understand. Luke tells it this way. He received them. That means he welcomed them. Even though he needed to get away still. If they're going to go that much trouble, you're welcome here. And he taught them things concerning the kingdom of God. If that was their interest to take him by force and make him a king, let me teach you about the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven, Jesus would say. They would hear about a kingdom very different than the one they had imagined. Verse 35. And when the day was far spent, his disciples came unto him and said, this is a desert place, and now the time is far past. Send them away that they may go into the country round about, into the villages, and buy themselves bread, for they have nothing to eat. And he answered and said to them, give ye them to eat. And they said unto him, shall we go buy 200 penny worth of bread and give them to eat? He said unto them, how many loaves have ye? Go and see. And when they knew, they say 5 loaves and 2 fishes. John tells us that it was Philip that found the food. Little boy had brought his lunch. You're talking about a boy's lunch. Don't think about loaves of Wonder Bread here. 5 loaves, that'd be 5 little flat cakes, like almost like little biscuits, you know. And 2 fishes. Think of fish like maybe a salted sardines. That's the kind of fishes that they would have packed around in those times. 5 loaves, that's not much. Look around, that's all we got. And he commanded them to make them all sit down by companies upon the green grass. You see the green grass? Matthew says there was grass. Mark says there was green grass. And John says there is much grass. I want you to see that fields, this full green. This would have been in the spring. Those wet winters would have watered that ground, and now here in the spring that grass has come up abundantly. And get the feel for this area now. He set them down by ranks in hundreds and by 50s. That's kind of like you divide out an army. Set them down together by hundreds and 50s. On this green grass. That's where John says much grass. And John 6:4 says it was the time of the Passover. Well, that's in the spring. And that may have been why there were so many in Galilee. Jews coming, gathering together to make that pilgrimage, that annual journey to Jerusalem to celebrate that feast of the Passover. So here they are, 5,000 of them now, out in this much green grass, away from the cities, at a time when they're hungry, and they sit down by 50s. And when he'd taken the 5 loaves, verse 41, and the 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed, and brake the loaves, and gave unto them of his disciples to set before them, and the 2 fishes divided he among them all. He blessed the food. Well, John explains what that means. It means he gave thanks. We say the blessing, don't we? Before we eat. If you don't, just make it a habit. Sit down to eat. I can't hardly eat at a restaurant without saying, well, let's have a blessing. And we'll just bow our heads and thank God for the food and say the blessing. That's what it means to bless the food, to thank God for this little meager meal. 5 loaves, 2 fishes. That's all we got. But we're thankful. So let's thank God for this. And then look what he did. He started breaking it and passing it out. And it says, when he'd taken the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, he looked up to heaven and blessed. Verse 4, they all did eat and were filled. 42. 43, they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments of the fishes. 44, and they that did eat of the loaves were about 5,000 men. You couldn't fake that. They weren't prepared. They didn't know these men were coming out there. They didn't get things ready. And with this one little meager meal, he fed them and took up many more leftovers than they had from the beginning. Look at the numbers. 5 loaves, 2 fishes, 5,000 men, 12 baskets. Mark and John both say 200 pennyworth would not buy enough food for all these men. Look at those numbers. You know, an accountant would love this, because he'd look at those numbers in Matthew, and Mark gives you the same numbers. And then go over to Luke, he gives you those same numbers. Go over to John, he's got those same numbers. The details of this story, they tell little different varying things about that. When you get down to the details, they all come up with the same numbers. They confirm one another in their accounts, don't they? I want to end it this way. Remember how he said that they were as sheep having no shepherd? I want you to think of that much green grass and the still waters of the Sea of Galilee. And then I want you to remember the 23rd Psalm. Here are some lines from the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. And all the leftover, my cup runneth over. These stories about Jesus and the miracles he did. Someone said, I would believe the Bible if it wasn't for those miracles. Well, the miracles are there so you will believe. Why would you expect God to walk on the earth in the form of flesh and not do any miracles? And the miracles that we read are not only the evidence that we need to know who Jesus is, they tell us who God is. He'd come to show us the Father. We have a God of compassion. We have a God that is capable. We have a God with an abundance for us and provides for us. And so the Lord is our shepherd. Well, that makes me want to come to Jesus. I don't know what those fellas thought when they got through eating and he dismissed them and sent them away and said, well, we don't have an army. What happened here? But I would think, Lord, this is the Jesus I want to follow. It would mean more to me now than it did before, when I had a better understanding of the kingdom of heaven and the kind of God that cares for me. Well, I hope it strikes you. And if you're not on good terms with God, this is the time to make that right when we extend this invitation and we stand and sing.